Okay, our lesson this morning is titled Kingdom Work, and we're in the 15th chapter of the book of Acts. Reading, I think it says verse 39, but that doesn't make sense starting it with 39. So I'm going to start with 36. Then after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us now go back and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord, and see how they are doing." Now Barnabas was determined to take with them John called Mark, but Paul insisted that they should not take it with them, the one who had departed from them in Pamphylia, and had not gone with them to the work. Then the contention became so sharp that they parted from one another, and so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Then he came to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was Greek. He was well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted to have him go with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in that region, for they all knew that his father was Greek. And as they went through the cities, they delivered to them the decrees to keep, which were determined by the apostles and elders at Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in number daily. Now, when they had gone through Phrygia and the region of Galatia, they were forbidden by the Holy Spirit to preach the word in Asia. And after they had come to Mysia, they tried to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit did not permit them. So passing by Mysia, they came down to Troas, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia stood and pleaded with him, saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." Now, after he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go to Macedonia, concluding that the Lord had called us to preach the gospel to them. Jesus defined the church's mission when he said, "Go and make disciples of all nations." And throughout history, church has sought to carry out that mission. Now, while there is general agreement on the necessity of evangelism, there is wide diversity as to the methods that we are to use. There are many different approaches, from simple presentations or just a few basic Bible verses to sophisticated multimedia events. The Lord only knows how many books, tapes, and seminars exist to train people in how to share their faith. Now, what is often overlooked in the emphasis on methodology are the essential foundational principles undergirding all true biblical evangelism. Our text this morning illustrates that evangelism calls for 5 things. First of all, it calls for to have the right passion, the right priority, the right personnel, the right precautions, and the right presentation at the right place. And we're going to see that Paul had the right passion when he said to Barnabas, "Let's go back and visit all of the churches that we set up on our first missionary journey." It was not as if Paul become bored with his work there at the church at Antioch. But you see, Paul had a problem. His problem was that he felt keenly the call of unevangelized nations. If Paul found a place or heard of a place where the gospel had not been preached, then Paul knew that was where he was needed. Paul was a very compassionate man, driven by a desire to preach the gospel, especially where it is yet to be proclaimed. And that passion that Paul had was the result of his love for God and his commitment to the obedience to his call. This passion led him later to write the words, "Woe is me if I cannot preach the gospel." You can't really understand the meaning of that passage, "Woe is me if I cannot preach the gospel," unless you yourself have been called to preach. I remember the first Sunday after I retired from full-time ministry. I went to church. I sat there in the pew and listened to somebody else, and I was miserable. And that passage came to me, "Woe is me if I can't preach." But it was my own bidding. I mean, I'm the one that called it quits. But that's the way Paul felt. Paul, I think, would have died if he had not been able to preach the gospel somewhere to somebody. Now, everywhere that Paul found himself, no matter how long he remained, was merely just another step to someplace else. For many years, he longed to visit Rome, and one would think that Rome would be Paul's ultimate goal, and that he would be content to minister there for the rest of his life. Yet even mighty Rome was merely another stopping place for Paul. Paul's compassionate concern for those without Christ found an echo in the heart of a man named J. Hudson Taylor, who was the English missionary to China. Hudson wrote, "I have a stronger desire than ever to go to China. Think of it, 360 million people without Christ, lost in the world. What a mission field." And so that's where he went. You know, a passion like that cannot be learned by studying evangelistic methods. It comes from knowing and loving Christ so deeply that some of his love for lost sinners becomes our own. And we know that knowing Christ comes from studying his word. Now, what motivated Paul, apart from his desire for the maturity of those that he had brought to the Lord, to revisit these converts from the first missionary journey? Well, first of all, he loved them as his own spiritual children. Every person Paul won to the Lord, he considered one of his own spiritual children, and he prayed for them. That is an element frequently missing in contemporary evangelism. There is too often failure to show enough love for those that have been led to Christ. The mistake of modern evangelism is find them, save them, forget about them. That's what happens to a lot of people who get saved in today's church. But that was not Paul. Paul's method was plant the crop, hoe the weeds, water the crop, and harvest the crop. And that's the way he went about his ministry. And then a second motive for revisiting his converts was Paul's commitment to the most effective evangelistic strategy of all. Paul wanted to build mature believers, not just spiritual infants. Paul knew that only mature believers are capable of reproducing themselves. The Apostle Paul was no hit-and-run evangelist. During his ministry at Ephesus, he wrote these words, "Night and day for a period of 3 years, he did not cease to admonish each one with tears." And there was everywhere Paul was, he continually prayed for the churches. He prayed for the people that he had won to the Lord. When there was a work to be done, God always uses the right people, the people of his choosing for the task. And to that end, he can and does use even the most negative circumstances to produce the most positive results. And this is what he did in the case that was detailed in our text. And so as Paul and Barnabas prepared to go on the second missionary journey, they stumble coming out of the starting gate. Barnabas says to Paul, I think we ought to take John Mark with us. I'm determined that he come with us. And Paul said, no way. There's no way we're taking that deserter with us on our next trip. Here are two men who faced all the dangers of that first missionary journey, close friends, now in a battle over one man, a man named John Mark. All we know about John Mark and why he left is that he just went back home. He started out with them. He started out great. But when they crossed over into Asia, John Mark turned around and he went home.
I was reading that he was Barnabas' cousin, Marcus.
Yes, he was.
That he got upset because Paul kind of took over. You know, Paul had a real strong personality, and he took over, and Mark got upset about that, and he went home.
Okay, very good. Barnabas says, I'm determined that he go with us. And again, Paul says, no way. No way am I taking that deserter. Now, the imperfect tense of the Greek verb was desirous, or was determined, shows that Barnabas was very persistent. But Paul was equally persistent and adamant. And he kept insisting they should not take him along because he had deserted them on the first journey. In other words, Paul had little or no confidence left in John Mark. This tough, battle-hardened soldier of Christ had no use for deserters in the fight that was ahead. But on the other hand, you've got the gentle Barnabas. Remember, his name means encouragement. He takes his cousin and they sail back to Cyprus, which was their home place. And eventually there arose such a sharp disagreement that these two men separated one from another. Now, the word sharp disagreement is the root of the English word paroxysm. Their partnership dissolved not on friendly terms, but with violent emotions. Now, the question arises, well, who was right? Was Paul right? Was Barnabas right? Well, the Bible does not explicitly say, but the weight of the evidence favors Paul. And it favors Paul because Paul was an apostle and Barnabas was not. Therefore, Barnabas should have submitted to Paul's apostolic authority. And also, it was Paul and Silas, not Barnabas and Mark, who were commended by the church. Barnabas should have realized that it would have been unwise and difficult to have Mark along if Paul did not trust him. And although they apparently never ministered together again, this is the last mention in the book of Acts of Barnabas. And we know that eventually they reconciled their differences because Paul later wrote approvingly of Barnabas' ministry. And even John Mark, the cause of all of the trouble by going with his cousin Barnabas. Somehow he turned his life around. Because we know that it was John Mark who became a disciple of Simon Peter. He was with Peter for quite a while. And we also know he ended up writing the very first gospel, the Gospel of Mark. So it was Barnabas' encouragement to his cousin that turned this young man's life around. And after his split with Barnabas, Paul chose Silas and departed, being committed by the brethren to the grace of the Lord. And so we have another of Satan's attempts to hinder the spread of the gospel that backfired. Because now there were two missionary teams instead of one. Their impact had doubled. Now, Paul's new partner, Silas, had been one of the leaders of the Jerusalem church. Remember last week when we were talking about the Jerusalem conference and the decisions that they made, and they sent two men back to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas to explain what those decisions were. Silas was one of those men. Silas was in every respect a suitable man for missionary work. As a prophet, he was adept at proclaiming and teaching the word. And as a Jew, he had entrance into the Jewish synagogues. As a Roman citizen, he enjoyed the same protection and benefits as did Paul. And his status as a respected leader of the Jerusalem church reinforced Paul's teaching that salvation was solely by grace. Remember I mentioned last week the letter that the Jerusalem church sent back to the church at Antioch, and how Paul took that letter with him on his second missionary journey and read it to all of the churches that he had set up. Now that was especially significant since part of their ministry involved delivering the decrees which had been decided upon by the disciples and the elders of the Jerusalem church. Now, on their first missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas had entered Asia Minor via the island of Cyprus. Remember, they went to Cyprus first, and then they crossed the water over into Asia, or which is modern-day Turkey today. But now with Barnabas and John Mark already there was no point in Paul and Silas going there. And so Paul chose instead to travel through Syria and Cilicia, thus entering Galatia from the opposite direction. In other words, they left Antioch and went northward through Syria over into Galatia. In other words, they came to their mission field from the complete opposite direction. Instead of coming up from the south, they're now coming down from the north. And the significance of that is going to become apparent. Now, Syria was the region around Antioch, and the neighboring region of Cilicia contained Paul's home city of Tarsus. Probably many of the churches around Tarsus had been founded by Paul. And as Paul and Silas traveled through these areas, they were busy with the priority strengthening the churches. Having crossed the rugged Taurus Mountains through the Cilician gates north of Tarsus, the missionaries came to Derbe and Lystra. Now, Paul and Barnabas had visited these cities on their first missionary journey, and Lystra had been the scene of some remarkable events. Remember, that's where Paul had healed a man. This so excited the people that they began calling Paul and Barnabas gods. They were going to throw a big shindig for them. And in response, the crowd wanted to crown the missionaries gods. And then following that, Paul had been stoned by some Jews from Antioch, almost to the point that he nearly died. Now, it was at Lystra that the missionaries were joined by a certain disciple named Timothy. Just as Silas had replaced Barnabas, so Timothy now replaces John Mark. Now the significance of Paul and Silas entering Asia Minor from the opposite direction becomes apparent. You see, had they followed the same route as the first journey, they would not have come to Lystra until the very end of the journey. By adding Timothy at the beginning of the journey, they had his help now for the entire trip. Timothy was to play a key role in Paul's life and eventually became his right-hand man. Timothy was also Paul's true child in the faith, as Paul had been the one that led Timothy to salvation. Now, Timothy was the son of a Jewish woman named Eunice, who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. The use of an imperfect tense verb instead of a present tense to refer to Timothy's father suggests that he was dead. He had already passed away. Now, Timothy, being both Jewish and Gentile, had access to both cultures. This was an important qualification for missionary service at that time. Timothy was a very young man, either in his late teens or early 20s. And he was well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra. This is a key requirement for church leaders, is that they be above reproach. And so Timothy, even in his youth, was qualified for service on that account. Now, Paul recognized the value that Timothy would be to the missionary team. And so he decided, I want him to go with us. This was an important step for Timothy and a sacrifice on the part of his family. You see, they knew all too well the danger he faced as Paul's companion. Eunice and Lois, who was Timothy's grandmother, probably still vividly recall the events of Paul's last visit to Lystra, where he ended up a bloody, battered mess as he was almost stoned to death. And they knew that it was possible that if Timothy joined Paul, he could end up the same way. Nevertheless, they permitted him to go. After being commissioned by the elders of the local assembly of believers, Timothy joined Paul and Silas, and the course of his life was set. You know, too often we look at missionary journeys of Paul as glorious and exciting. But I think many times we overlook the dangers and hardships these missionaries faced. Listen to how Paul described his missionary life. In his letter to the Corinthians, in the second letter, listen to what Paul wrote. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequently, in death often. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep, in journeys of 10, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, besides the other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for the churches. Doesn't it sound very exciting, does it? That's what Paul went through as a missionary. It is hard to believe. Now, with Timothy's father likely dead, and having been a Gentile in any case, Paul assumed the role of a father and took Timothy and he had him circumcised. Now, a lot of people have sharply criticized Paul for doing this, accusing him of falling into the same heresy he spoke against at the Jerusalem conference. Remember, that was one of the big things that these Judaizers were trying to get the Gentiles to do, to be circumcised. And so they're saying, Paul, all you've done is fall into the same trap you've been against. But nowhere is it stated or implied that Paul circumcised Timothy so that he could be saved. The text clearly says, Paul circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those parts, for they all knew that his father was a Gentile. Now, circumcision was the physical sign of Judaism. Had Timothy not been circumcised, the Jews would have assumed he was renouncing his Jewish heritage and choosing to live as a Gentile. In other words, his chances of winning some of the Jews would have been very slim. So Timothy's circumcision had nothing to do with salvation. Paul had him circumcised for expediency's sake, to avoid placing an unnecessary stumbling block in the way of Jewish evangelism. Now, Timothy's circumcision then granted him full access to the synagogues that he would be visiting along with Paul and Silas. And it's significant that later Paul refused to circumcise another of his helpers, a man named Titus. But the difference is Titus was a full-blooded Gentile. And to have circumcised Titus would have been to capitulate to legalism. From Paul's actions concerning his two companions, Timothy and Titus, they both form an important principle that becomes evident. Missionaries must be sensitive to the unique characteristics of the cultures in which they work. Now, as Paul did in circumcising Timothy, they should avoid giving any unnecessary offense. But like Paul in refusing to circumcise Titus, they must not compromise any of the timeless truths of Scripture. Now, verses 4 and 5 show that these missionaries had the right presentation. Ultimately, the key to biblical evangelization is the right message, and that message is simply salvation by grace alone. That was the message they had. That was the message they preached. And as they passed through the cities of Galatia, this missionary team was delivering the decrees which had been decided by the apostles and the elders of the Jerusalem church. They were spreading the liberating truth affirmed at the Jerusalem Council, that salvation was wholly by God's grace. Also, that new believers would not be hindered in their fellowship with their Jewish brothers. They informed the churches of the regulations imposed on the Gentiles. That is the twofold message of Christianity. salvation by grace and living by love. Now, Luke's summary statement shows the healthy effect of sound biblical evangelism and discipleship. He notes that the churches were being strengthened in the faith and were increasing in number daily. The goal of evangelism is not to rack up huge numbers of converts. Yet it is true that strong churches established in the faith will increase in number. Now, the remainder of our text shows us that Paul and company would be in the right place. They were not where Paul wanted to be, but they were going to be where God wanted them to be. And that's important. Now, Paul's plan was to go north up into Galatia and preach there. But this plan was forbidden by the Holy Spirit. Now, since Asia was no longer an acceptable destination, the group continued north until they arrived at Mysia. Notice that verse 7 tells us the Spirit of Jesus stopped them once more. This time, rather than the Holy Spirit saying no, it's the Spirit of Jesus who redirected the team. Some Bible students have suggested that the change from the Holy Spirit to the Spirit of Jesus is nothing more than a stylistic variation. Others note that the change has a theological emphasis. The Holy Spirit is the Spirit of the resurrected Jesus. This emphasizes that Jesus continued to direct his missionaries and his people in the spread of the gospel of salvation. Now, while Paul and his team were the evangelistic missionaries, it was by the direction and the power of the triune God that they accomplished their work. It is very important why God said no to Galatia and no to Mysia. God is now getting ready to evangelize the continent of Europe. That very night, Paul has a vision. And in this vision, he sees a man from Macedonia, which is over in Europe. And this man is saying, please come over and help us. We desperately need help. Now, there has been a lot of speculation. Who was this man that Paul saw in his vision? Some people have said it was Luke, the writer of the book of Acts. And that's very possible. But whether it was Luke or someone else, there's good evidence that it could have been Luke. Because in verse 10, we come to the first of the four we passages in the book of Acts. Because in these passages, Luke shifts from using the third person plural they to the first person plural we. So whether he was Luke or not, one thing is certain. All of a sudden, Luke becomes a member of Paul's missionary team. And we know that Luke stays with Paul even through his imprisonment. Now, as Paul related his vision to his team, they were all in agreement that the vision's source was God. Up to this point, they had received negative travel instructions where they should go and should not go. They were not to go to Asia. They were not to go to Bithynia. Now, finally, they had received clear direction as to where God wanted them to be. That they acted immediately indicates their unhesitatingly obedience to God's direction. And at this point, the evangelization of Europe begins. They cross over into Macedonia. They stop at Philippi. And at Philippi, Paul founds a church there, beginning with a group of women. I believe that's what we studied last week, wasn't it? Our text this morning illustrates the foundational principles of evangelism. God uses the right people who have the right passion, who have the right priority, who take the right precautions to make the right presentation in the right place. See, this is evident that God was in charge the entire time, and He was leading this missionary team to carry out their mission. And that concludes the lesson. Any questions?